Are you ready, kids?
Hello, it's Employee A Million here, and welcome to another edition of SpongeComs. Today I'm going to be doing a SpongeCom on Season 1, Episode 3, Jellyfishing and Plankton, both of which aired on July 31st, 1999. But before I get started, here's my question of the week for you. What is your favourite introductory episode? As in, what was your favourite episode where a character debuted, or a theme even debuted? Write what you think is the best answer, and it might be featured on the show next week. But for now, let's get on to jellyfishing. Jellyfishing was actually written by quite a lot of people: Steve Fonte, Chris Mitchell, Peter Burns, and Tim Hill. Not many of which you see, well into the show's future, but the animation director for this was Alan Smage, who has stuck with SpongeBob all this time, and you can tell that he's had quite the influence on the show because this episode, for all the problems it has, it is pretty beautiful, and you'll be able to see that if you're syncing this up to the actual footage or a digital download, which I recommend you do. You'll see that SpongeBob's house, I think this was a very, very early episode, probably the 4th or 5th, and they didn't have a full layout of SpongeBob's house yet. So you get a lot of these abstract backgrounds during this action getting prepared for jellyfishing montage. And it's certainly unique. I don't know if it was intentionally like this or if they just didn't have SpongeBob's house in terms of resources yet. Those red bamboo sticks there does sort of feel like the light blue bamboo sticks you see in his living room and all that. But those spiral effects, you don't see those anymore. But yeah, I do really like this this intro to the episode where they just get really pumped up to go jellyfishing, which is a new concept that this episode introduces. Well, Tea at the Tree Dome had it a little bit, but here's where they go all out in explaining what jellyfishing is, how it's meant to be fun, and it's basically like butterfly catching. Not many people do that anymore, but it's just an example of how geeky SpongeBob is. And you've got a frame up here that is shown in certain promotional artwork. It's Patrick sitting on SpongeBob. That is sometimes tossed around. I think the production or promotional team traced stuff like that. You have a pose of Squidward and Bubble Stand and a pose of SpongeBob later on when he's pointing to Squidward's music sheets in this episode that do feel like they were good enough poses. Let's just advertise them through those means, and I think that they are iconic poses. If you see any classic SpongeBob advertisements from the early to mid 2000s, you're bound to see something from one of these very early season 1 episodes on it. The most prominent being SpongeBob winking at the end of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy. And yeah, I think that is a pretty good thing because they're recognizable moments. Not super recognizable moments, but you can tell what's going on in them. So yeah, back to jellyfish and what they are, exactly what their purpose in SpongeBob is. Their main purpose is to be pests, in any way, shape, or form, whether they be birds or flies. Sometimes they have underwater flies, but who cares? Essentially, jellyfish serve as an obstacle in Bikini Bottom. So that's why jellyfishing is such an interesting concept, because you have these very dangerous creatures, but SpongeBob wants to go butterfly catching to get them. I don't know if Steven Hillenburg intended for that to be subversive, you should be friends with any creature as long as you don't get killed by it. But I need to talk over this really boring, drawn out scene. It's fine, it's funny, but there isn't much going on, and here's what people really want me to talk about jellyfishing with. In the top 5 best and worst season 1 episodes list I did a year ago, I put this at number 2 on the worst list, and I don't mean that as in this is a bad episode. I said that it's alright, it's fine, and there are a number of reasons why I don't like it as much as 39 other season 1 episodes, but we'll get to those when we get to those. But I do think that this episode does excel in awkward comedy, in a way. You've got this, which is pretty slow and drawn out again. So if you're into that, then jellyfishing might be up your alley, but it just still seemed like that they were working out the kinks in terms of exactly how the comedy in this show should work. And you've also got Squidward in a full body cast. Yeah, Squidward doesn't... It gives off the illusion that Squidward's doing a bit, but he isn't actually doing a lot. I think that's one of the make it or break it things in this episode. Like, nowadays, in 2019, we're so used to SpongeBob and Patrick just making each of Squidward's days a living hell that we don't really stop to think about how Squidward felt the very first time it really went this way. And for most of this, he's just in a wheelchair, in a full body cast, angry. It certainly said a lot back when there were only 3 other episodes that did this sort of thing, Reflower, Bubble Stand, and maybe Help Wanted, but especially this one. Oh, and we've also got Best Day Ever, which is, I think, a mantra that they wanted to squeeze into the show at some points, but it didn't really come to fruition until the first SpongeBob movie. And this is a clever visual gag. I like when it spells bad on Squidward's face. But there it is. But the rest of this scene in Squidward's house with SpongeBob and Patrick trying to cheer him up, like, I can relate to them. I think they're doing an alright job. They never really physically harmed Squidward up to this point, but they do emotionally harm him. Let's just say that. It's just, you've got a lot of scenes like this now, so there isn't much need to go back to this. And that isn't a problem with this episode. It is the 3rd. Well, technically it's the 6th, if we're counting, like, all the segments, but yeah, they did need some starting ground, and I think that this episode did have a purpose, like Bubble Stand, to get people into SpongeBob, for people to understand what the heck this world is, and they also introduced jellyfishing, so I think this episode has a benefit in that regard. And here we are, Jellyfish Fields. This is just such a lovely place just to look at. Such a nice grassy plains area, because most of the ground in Bikini Bottom and in SpongeBob episodes is sand, so it's nice to see some grass every once in a while. And it's also nice to see the emergence of a pretty famous moment where Patrick just slams a jellyfish net into Squidward's broken hand, I assume. It looks more like a cotton ball. And yeah, I think this is one of the only few times that Patrick actually harms Squidward in this episode, and even then he can't really do much about it, and it's funny anyway. Now, what's coming up is a teensy-weensy musical number where SpongeBob and Patrick hum alongside to a piece of classical music that you've probably heard time and time again. It's called The Blue Danube. I think that's how you spell it. Danube. You also hear it in 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's just like a comparison of where you might have heard it before. It's not the da-da, it's the da-da-da-dum. That's an odd comparison, 2001: A Space Odyssey to SpongeBob, but just wait until we get to SB129. What I do really like about this scene, except for that one frame that went on a bit too long, is just how SpongeBob and Patrick completely fail by the end of it. And they turn into a cartoon ball of violence against themselves while the jellyfish stings them. So yeah, even though they like jellyfishing is a threat still to them. So I think that makes the harm the jellyfish caused to Squidward not as intense, and oof, that's a really good effect, making Squidward smile there. But again, I think that this episode, it was useful in 1999 and 2000, but we have a lot better jellyfishing episodes now. Like, we don't have this sort of ending where it's just slow and ominous. It is... But here we see the first queen jellyfish in the show. We do see it again in I'm Your Biggest Fanatic from season 2, which is objectively a better episode than this, I should say. And yeah, I think that it is pretty intimidating here, even if it's not 100% funny, because now it just seems like they're torturing Squidward, and Squidward and torture go together a bit too much in this day and age. But yeah, I think they went the extra mile with this one, and it does sort of it isn't really as funny as it should be, especially because SpongeBob and Patrick don't actually get hurt with the Queen Jellyfish and Squidward wanting to catch the jellyfish but getting hurt. That doesn't seem as justified. Like with SpongeBob and Patrick, they do try to give off the illusion that they were hurt later on when they're covered in bandages, but it doesn't really come off that way. Apologies. Like, the reason I've got more positive to say about this episode than negative, despite it not aging the best, is because I do want to try and keep this as unbiased as possible. I do want to look at each of these SpongeBob episodes as a work of art, even if they're 20-year-old works of art that have been superseded. And, oh, here we come with Squidward in an even tighter body cast and a green IV that isn't connected to him. I wonder what that's about. So yeah, unbiased as possible, because these are episodes that at least one person on the planet enjoys, even stuff like A Pal for Gary and SpongeBob You're Fired, which I am not going to get to for years and years if I continue on. But yeah, this episode does have its merit. I think any SpongeBob episode does have its merit, including this joke right here. I think that's one of Patrick's best lines in season 1. Yup, he's still mad. In general, I think people think that Patrick is a bit smarter in this episode than SpongeBob, but he does cause more harm to Squidward. And yeah, I do say this a lot, but Patrick's characterization kind of flip-flopped across season 1. He was a lot of different things. And SpongeBob itself, the show, was a lot of different things in season 1, especially in the very early part of season 1. And Jellyfishing was a reminder of what SpongeBob could have and is. Plankton was written by Ennio Teresen Jr., Eric Weiss, and Mr. Lawrence. Mr. Lawrence in particular is the voice actor for Plankton and has been for exactly 20 years now. I talked about this in the previous episode. He's also the voice actor for Larry, but Plankton is the role that he's known for, and for good reason, because this is a really great episode. And SpongeBob here is putting on a French accent, and I think that this was meant to be a running joke because he puts on like a Texan accent while preparing the patties and pickles. So I think maybe they were going to try and have him do different accents every time he's preparing, but it might have been a joke that fell through pretty quickly because it was hard to understand. I don't know. It's just something I spitball about whenever I watch these super early episodes. And here's something that's really established in this episode, the value of Krabby Patties, because SpongeBob was able to make them super quickly and help wanted, and now we know exactly why there's such a big deal, because they're absolutely delicious, and this little guy, this competitor, wants them for himself, the recipe, and that person is Plankton. A plankton is basically a microorganism, if you don't know, and they have a lot of fun playing with just how small plankton are in this first episode. Like, Plankton is really, really small in this episode. Sometimes they make him the size of a jelly bean later on. That's his de facto size is about 2 inches, but he's like half an inch. And I think that makes him a little more intimidating, honestly, that someone this tiny can be that big of a deal. I think that is part of what makes Plankton such an interesting character. And here we have an early laugh for SpongeBob that would get on my nerves pretty quickly if it stuck around. Tom Kenny does say that he was working on different laughs throughout this early bit of SpongeBob, and ironically the one that you hear in Ripped Pants is a bit closer to the one we have now. Like, it doesn't start to become fully formed until a little later in season 1. And this scene set at night is really, really good, because there's just so much mystery to it. Plankton is such a mysterious character in this first episode, but they don't forget to make him funny. And that's something that I have to give credit for this episode. It is very easy it would have been very easy to make Plankton like this very out of genre, very serious person, but they did understand the like juxtaposition of a big voice on a very small body, and yeah, it makes for some really good moments, like this one where he's just trying to manipulate SpongeBob into getting him a Krabby Patty. Mr. Lawrence's voice acting in particular really sells that this is some guy that SpongeBob's just met. And also the camera angles here also really work in making SpongeBob seem so huge compared to Plankton. Because he's a generally short guy, but compared to Plankton, he is just a kid. And we also get the introduction of his fascination with spatulas, which was also in Help Wanted to an extent, but this is where they start to go all out with it, with a golden spatula being an item that Plankton uses to manipulate him. I think that works very well. And yeah, the part that everyone remembers this episode is the second half where Plankton is controlling SpongeBob's mind, and I'll get to that when I get to that. But this part is still really good. It's not really talked about, but it is a very fun moment that does establish what SpongeBob and Plankton's relationship starts off as. Like, they do get more friendly with each other with time, as SpongeBob understands why Plankton is the way he is. And something I did want to also bring up is that you can see Plankton's behind in certain shots in this episode, and I don't know if it's something that Nickelodeon censored later on, like they took it out of his character model to appease Nickelodeon executives, but yeah, I'm fine with the lack of rear end, because it is a teensy bit distracting, I have to admit. This alphabet song coming up is easy to find on YouTube, and a lot of the comments are like, how did I get here? Well, you know how you got there. You got there through me now. And now Plankton goes into SpongeBob's head, and like, the art in here is really good. Like, this show has some really, really great background paintings. And SpongeBob's brain here is really, really small when you think about it, but it does look really good. Like, the backgrounds in SpongeBob are very, not completely abstract like the ones you see in Jellyfishing, but they are a little grainy, a little flawed. It makes them a bit more cartoony, but a bit more realistic, and that's what I like. There are these little things about SpongeBob that I always enjoy going back to once I've seen an episode like 10 times in a year and understand what it's like. And here's Plankton's college-educated plan, and it's just two things on a blueprint. That is my favorite joke in the episode. Well, one of my favorites. This episode is just a laugh riot. I do feel like this should have actually been much later in the season, but I do understand that they did want to introduce characters early. And we've also got another great line coming up about SpongeBob's balanced breakfast. That's how you do visual humor. And here's SpongeBob's black tie that appears for a couple seconds before turning red again. But at least we never see those pants again throughout this episode. I think it's just a lot funnier to have SpongeBob in his underwear throughout this while he's being mind controlled. Like, still intimidating, but we do have to understand that this is a silly situation. Oh, and Squidward's role in this episode, just being part of this weird nightmare sequence. Well, not an actual nightmare sequence, but it is pretty intimidating compared to what we've seen on the show thus far. Like, imagine your neighbor doing this. That's part of the comedy with Squidward. Imagine being this neighbor in this crazy place. Squidward doesn't really do a lot with Plankton, and vice versa. Like, we get a couple episodes in season 8, neither of which are very good, honestly, but I'll get to those when I get to those. I think that's going to be my moral code is I'll get to that when I get to that. And what we're coming up to is probably some of the best, like, atmosphere in the show. The old school chum bucket and just how intimidating it looks. It's just so ominous and mysterious. I've used ominous pretty frequently recently, but it is a good word to describe it. It is such a dark place, like atmospherically. It is just very, like, it's basically a sitcom set in like season 2 onward, but here it's, oh my gosh, that light, it just makes it feel so scary to SpongeBob. And also we get the guest star of this episode, Alex, I think his name is, the Labrador. He is technically the first guest star on the show, if you're not counting Tiny Tim through archival footage. So yeah, this starts off the trend. I don't think Alex is alive anymore. He'd probably be like 28 now. And also what we've got coming up is an early version of Karen, where she's basically just an analyzer, still voiced by Jill Taylor, I think her name is. I didn't look that up before this. But yeah, Tom Kenny's wife, not Mr. Lawrence's. That makes this incredibly awkward and makes a lot of other SpongeBob and Karen episodes very awkward, like Single Cell Anniversary and Karen's Virus. That's just another fun little tidbit that I have for you guys. But despite all the pure attitude in this episode, it does have a very sweet ending, sweet-ish, where SpongeBob solves the problem by just complimenting the Krabby Patty and how good it looks, and Plankton fetishizes over it. It's still silly, but yeah, there is some emotion behind it, and I think that sort of alleviates just the sort of tension that this episode was building up to, with all the mysterious introductions and the mind control and the Squidward scene in particular and the chum bucket. Oh, we get some live action footage here of a Krabby Patty being assembled. They go back and forth on whether the Krabby Patty secret formula is the ingredients for the patty mix itself or the combination of ingredients for the burger. And yeah, this scene would have confused me as a kid because, well, it did confuse me as a kid because he just says it right in front of Plankton. It has cheese, tomatoes, and all that. Oh, and also 99% hot gas. Such a classic line. But yeah, I think more often than not, they describe the Krabby Patty secret formula as the ingredients for the patty mix. So I think that can be justified. And in general, this is a pretty great ending to a very, very good episode. I really like this one. It introduced Plankton, one of the best characters on the show, and it was also paired with introducing the concept of jellyfishing and also Squidward torture, but that's beside the point. So yeah, 2 very notable early season 1 episodes. Again, my question of the week this week is, what is your favorite introductory episode? Reply with your answer in the comments, and it might be featured at the end of the next show. So, goodbye for now.